Before the wedding, my stepdaughter didn't hesitate. She said the most meaningful gift I could give her was not being there. She said I wasn't her father, and that my presence would confuse the moment. My wife stood beside her and said nothing. Not in agreement, not in protest, just silence. In that silence, I understood exactly where I ranked in the life I had been financing for years. So I made a decision just as quietly. I sold the house they assumed would always be theirs. I canceled the wedding I was paying for. I stepped out of the role they had already erased. But before I left, I placed one final thing behind, something neither of them expected, and something they wouldn't understand until it was far too late. If you've ever been slowly pushed out of a family you helped build, I hope you'll stay with me. Consider subscribing, not because it helps a channel, but because it helps stories like this get told. And if you've lived something similar, I'd like to hear it in the comments. Sometimes knowing you're not alone is the only thing that steadies you. This isn't a story about anger. It's about absence, and what happens when you finally choose it for yourself. The moment didn't happen in private, and that was what made it unbearable. If it had been a conversation behind a closed door, I might have mistaken it for confusion, nerves, or even grief. But it wasn't private. It unfolded in front of people who barely knew me, people who would only remember the outline of the moment, not the years that led to it. We were at a pre-wedding tasting event at a restored barn just outside Charlottesville. The kind of place that sells nostalgia by the hour. Exposed beams, white linens, long wooden tables arranged in clean, confident lines. There were wine flights laid out like museum exhibits and coordinators moving through the space with clipboards pressed to their chests, rehearsing efficiency. Guests drifted in and out as if the celebration had already begun, as if the wedding itself were just a formality. I had paid for all of it. The venue, the catering, the tasting itself. I stood there with a glass of red wine in my hand, listening to conversations overlap, feeling oddly unnecessary in a room I had funded into existence. My stepdaughter, Lily, moved through the space with ease. She was glowing in the way people do when they believe the world is arranging itself around them. Engaged, surrounded, confident. People gravitated toward her without effort. She had that quality, an assurance that made others orbit her decisions without question. I watched her accept compliments, nod thoughtfully at suggestions, laugh at the right moments. I stayed near the edge of the group, not withdrawn, just observant. I had learned long ago that if you pay attention, people will tell you exactly where you stand without ever addressing you directly. Someone near the tasting table asked a logistical question. It was casual, tossed into the air the way people ask about weather or parking. They wanted to know how the seating would be arranged for the ceremony. Who would be in the front row? Who would walk in first? Parents? Family? It was a small question, a harmless one. Lily answered before anyone else could. Her voice was light, almost cheerful, as if she were clarifying a menu option that had been misunderstood. She said the front row was reserved for real family. She didn't look at me when she said it. She didn't need to. The sentence landed where it was meant to. She went on to explain that it was important to her to honor her biological father's memory, to keep the ceremony focused and uncluttered. She spoke carefully, choosing words that sounded respectful on the surface. There was no malice in her tone, just certainty. People nodded. A few murmured understanding. Someone commented on how meaningful that was. Another said it made perfect sense. No one looked at me. That was the part that stayed with me. Not the words themselves, but the way the room adjusted around them. How easily the circle closed without me. How quickly my absence was absorbed as the correct configuration. I stood there holding a glass I never drank from, feeling the weight of something I hadn't realized I was carrying. I understood in that moment that I had already been removed. Not dramatically, not cruelly, just efficiently, as if I were an extra chair that didn't match the set. No one asked how I felt about it. No one checked my expression. The coordinators kept moving. The wine kept flowing. The conversation shifted to table arrangements and floral accents. I stayed for the rest of the tasting. That might sound strange, but leaving would have drawn attention, and attention would have required explanation. I wasn't ready to explain anything yet, even to myself. I nodded when spoken to. I smiled when appropriate. I complimented the food and thanked the staff. Inside, something quiet was recalibrating. I thought about the years that had brought me there. 13 of them. I had entered Lily's life when she was still young enough to need rides to school and reminders about homework. I hadn't tried to replace anyone. I hadn't insisted on titles or rituals that weren't offered. I had shown up consistently and without announcement. That had always seemed like the correct approach. I remembered teaching her how to drive in an empty parking lot. My hands folded in my lap as she gripped the wheel too tightly. I remembered sitting in the audience at school events where she never looked for me, but where I still felt it mattered to be present. I remembered late-night calls when her mother was working and Lily needed help navigating something she didn't want to say out loud. None of those moments were dramatic. None of them were heroic. They were small, accumulative acts that I had assumed counted for something. Standing there in that barn, I realized they counted only as long as they were convenient. When the event finally wound down, people hugged Lily goodbye and praised the evening. I helped load leftovers into the car because no one else was paying attention. Lily thanked me politely, the way you thank someone who has done their part and can now step aside. The drive home was quiet. My wife, Ellen, talked about timelines and vendors and how well everything had gone. She didn't mention the moment. She didn't ask how I was feeling. She didn't acknowledge that anything unusual had occurred. I didn't bring it up. Not yet. I had learned something important that evening, and it wasn't about seating charts or ceremonies. It was about visibility, about how easily a person can be present in every practical way and still be considered extraneous. By the time we pulled into the driveway, I knew one thing with absolute clarity. The humiliation wasn't the comment itself. It was realizing that no one believed I belonged there enough to question it. The clarification didn't end at the tasting. That would have been almost merciful, an isolated moment I could rationalize away as stress or poor phrasing. But later that evening, once the guests had thinned out and the staff had begun resetting tables, Lily made it official. She approached me not with hesitation, but with preparation. The kind that comes from rehearsing a position long enough to believe it's already settled. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't accuse. She framed everything as if we were simply aligning expectations that had somehow gone misunderstood. She explained that the ceremony was about honoring her biological father's memory, that it was important to keep the narrative clean, focused, undiluted. Having me present, she said, would blur that. It would confuse people. It would feel staged. I noticed the language she chose. Not emotional, not personal, curated. She acknowledged, without embarrassment, that I was paying for the wedding. The venue, the caterer, the band, even the shuttle buses bringing guests from the hotel. She didn't deny it or minimize it. She simply separated it from the rest of the conversation, the way you separate accounting from design. The money, she implied, was already spent. A settled matter. A transaction completed. My presence, however, was optional. She spoke as though she were correcting an administrative error, as though I had misunderstood the scope of my role. There was no cruelty in her tone, which somehow made it worse. Cruelty can be argued with. This was presented as a reasonable adjustment. I looked to my wife, Ellen, standing beside her. I wasn't searching for a defense, just a signal, a pause, a recalibration. Anything that suggested the situation was still open to discussion. Ellen said nothing. She stood there with her hands folded, listening as if this were information being shared rather than a decision being enacted. Her face was neutral, calm. She didn't nod in agreement, but she didn't challenge anything either. Her silence was practiced, controlled. That was when I understood this conversation wasn't spontaneous. This wasn't Lily improvising a boundary. It was a conclusion that had already been reached somewhere else, in a space where I hadn't been invited. Lily went on to say that the ceremony wasn't about me, that it wasn't personal, that it was about authenticity, about honoring the past without complications. She said she hoped I could respect that. Respect. The word landed heavily. I realized then that my role had been quietly redefined. Not as a parent, not even as a step-parent, but as a benefactor whose relevance ended at the receipt. My contribution was financial, not symbolic. Useful, not visible. I asked one question, just one. I asked whether she believed I had ever tried to replace her father. She hesitated for half a second too long. Then she said no, but followed it with a qualifier. She said I sometimes acted as if my support entitled me to involvement. That generosity didn't automatically translate to authority. That being helpful wasn't the same as belonging. The words were measured, balanced, almost compassionate. They still landed like an inventory of grievances I hadn't known were being tallied. Ellen remained silent. Not once did she interject to remind Lily of the years, the school runs, the hospital visits, the quiet consistencies that don't photograph well but still form a life. Not once did she say that I had earned a seat by showing up when it wasn't convenient. Instead, she watched me absorb it. I realized then that this wasn't just Lily's boundary. It was consensus. There's a particular kind of betrayal that doesn't announce itself. It doesn't shout or accuse. It simply rearranges reality and waits for you to notice. That was what this was. Procedural betrayal. Executed with politeness and confidence. I nodded. I thanked Lily for explaining her perspective. That surprised her. I could tell she had expected resistance, maybe even anger. What she didn't understand was that anger requires a belief that something can still be negotiated. This couldn't. When the conversation ended, she seemed relieved. Lighter, as if a difficult task had been completed successfully. Ellen touched my arm briefly on the way out, a gesture so small it might have been mistaken for habit. The drive home was quieter than before. Ellen spoke about timelines again, about final payments, about dress fittings and rehearsal logistics. She talked as if nothing had shifted, as if the foundation beneath us hadn't just cracked open. I didn't interrupt. That night, after she went to bed, I stayed awake. Not restless, just alert. I replayed the evening in my mind, not searching for insult, but for clarity. And what I found was simple. They hadn't excluded me out of anger. They had excluded me out of comfort. It was easier to erase me than to reconcile what my presence complicated. Easier to accept my money than my place. Easier to call it respect than to admit it was convenience. That realization didn't hurt the way humiliation had earlier. Steadied me, because once you understand how you are being categorized, you can decide whether you're willing to remain in that category. By the time morning came, I knew I wasn't. What followed wasn't an argument. There was no raised voice, no emotional crescendo, no dramatic line drawn in the sand. That would have been easier to process. This was something colder. It was a correction. Lily spoke again later that night, after Ellen and I had returned home and the house had settled into its familiar quiet. She came into the kitchen while I was rinsing a glass I hadn't used, the hum of the dishwasher filling the space between us. She leaned against the counter the way people do when they believe they're about to say something reasonable. She said she wanted to be clear, so there wouldn't be misunderstandings later. She said I had always acted entitled to involvement. That over the years, I had confused generosity with authority. That I had mistaken support for belonging. She spoke calmly, almost academically, as if she were outlining a concept she'd studied and now felt confident explaining. There was no anger in her face, no resentment, just certainty. She said I wasn't her father. She said I was just the man her mother married. That sentence didn't arrive sharply. It arrived flatly, like a statement of fact that required no emotional weight because, to her, the conclusion was obvious. I waited for Ellen to say something. Anything. I waited for a clarification, a softening, a reminder of context. I waited for my wife to step into the space between us and do what partners are supposed to do when lines are being crossed. Ellen stayed where she was. She didn't interrupt, didn't object, didn't reframe the statement into something less absolute. She stood there with her arms loosely crossed, watching the exchange as if it were inevitable, as if it had been a long time coming. In that stillness, I understood something that took longer to articulate than it did to register. This wasn't Lily speaking out of turn. This was Lily speaking with permission. The silence beside her wasn't uncertainty. It was endorsement. I felt something shift then. Not pain exactly, but a recalibration of reality. I had spent years believing I was part of a family structure that simply required patience and restraint. That my role was quieter, but no less real. In that moment, I saw that I had been living inside an assumption no one else shared. Lily went on. She said that I had a habit of inserting myself into milestones that weren't mine. That I showed up in ways that made her feel observed rather than supported. That my presence, however well-intentioned, carried an expectation she had never agreed to. Expectation. That word echoed. I thought about how carefully I had avoided expectations. I had never insisted on walking her down an aisle. Never corrected her when she didn't call me by any title at all. Never demanded acknowledgement beyond what she offered. I had believed that restraint was respect. What I was hearing now was that restraint had been interpreted as presumption. I asked her quietly when she had started feeling this way. She said it had always been that way, that she had simply learned to tolerate it. That now, with the wedding approaching, it was important to set boundaries before resentment had a chance to grow. Set boundaries. Again, the language was clean, therapeutic, designed to sound healthy even as it erased years of shared history. Ellen finally spoke then, but not in the way I had hoped. She didn't challenge Lily's framing. She didn't question the fairness of it. She said only that Lily needed to do what felt right for her, and that everyone would need to adjust. Adjust. I looked at my wife and realized that whatever private negotiations had occurred before this moment had not included me. Decisions had been made, lines drawn, roles defined, and I was being briefed after the fact. That realization didn't spark anger. It sparked clarity. I saw how often Ellen had avoided conflict by allowing narratives to form around her rather than through her. How silence had become her way of choosing without owning the choice. How neutrality over time had tilted consistently in one direction. This wasn't just about the wedding. It was about the accumulation of moments where my presence had been convenient but my position had been undefined. About the way support had been welcomed but authority had been quietly denied. About how easy it had been for everyone else to agree on who I wasn't, without ever discussing who I was supposed to be. Lily finished speaking and waited, as if expecting reassurance. As if she wanted me to confirm that I understood my place now that it had been clearly outlined. I told her I appreciated her honesty. That surprised her. I could see it in the slight hesitation that crossed her face. She had prepared for resistance, maybe even hurt. What she hadn't prepared for was acceptance. Because I did understand. I understood that I had been living on borrowed status. That my inclusion had always been conditional. That the moment I complicated the narrative by existing too visibly, by being too present, I became something that needed to be managed. After she left the room, Ellen stood there with me for a moment. She asked if I was okay. I told her I was processing. That night, lying awake in a bed that suddenly felt unfamiliar, I replayed the conversation not with bitterness, but with attention. I stripped away tone and intention and looked only at structure. And the structure was clear. I had been categorized as auxiliary, optional, financially essential but emotionally peripheral. I was expected to contribute without imprinting, to give without shaping, to remain available without being acknowledged as integral. That kind of arrangement only works when one person agrees to remain small. I realized then that I had already been shrinking for years, mistaking patience for humility and silence for strength. I had believed that consistency would eventually translate into belonging. What it had translated into was invisibility. By the time morning light crept into the room, I wasn't angry. I wasn't devastated. I was done negotiating a role no one intended to honor. And for the first time since the wedding planning had begun, I wasn't thinking about how to fix anything. I was thinking about how to remove myself, cleanly, completely, and on my own terms. That night I didn't sleep, not because I was restless, but because something in me had shifted from endurance to assessment. There's a difference. Endurance absorbs. Assessment measures. I lay awake long enough to recognize which mode I was in. Then I got out of bed and went to my study. The room looked the same as it always had. Shelves of books I rarely referenced anymore. A desk that had become a place for mail and receipts rather than decisions. I turned on the lamp and sat down, not with a sense of urgency, but with the calm focus that comes when a conclusion has already been reached and now simply needs to be validated. I started pulling files. Not out of spite, not to prove a point, but because clarity requires facts, and I had lived long enough to know that memory is too generous when left unchallenged. I opened drawers I hadn't touched in years. Manila folders labeled with dates, properties, account summaries. Documents I had once filed away because things were handled and no longer required attention. I realized how often trust encourages neglect. How easy it is to stop checking when you believe you're part of something stable. The first thing I reviewed was the deed to the house. The Ridgewood house had been purchased years before my marriage to Ellen. I remembered the closing clearly. I had bought it during a period when my work required proximity to the city, and I wanted something modest but solid. It had been mine outright. No shared title. No revisions. I had never retitled it after the marriage because there had never seemed a reason to. The deed confirmed it. Sole ownership. My name alone. I felt no satisfaction reading that. Just alignment. The paperwork matched reality in a way the conversations had not. Next, I looked at the wedding contracts. Venue agreement. Catering. Entertainment. Transportation. Every signature was mine. Every payment drawn from accounts I controlled. No joint funds. No shared liability. I had insisted on that early on, not out of mistrust, but out of habit. I had always kept financial structures clean. Prevented confusion later. I hadn't realized how important that instinct would become. As the hours passed, a pattern emerged. Not a sinister one, but a revealing one. The story Lily and Ellen were telling themselves was that I was peripheral. That I was involved, yes, but not essential. That I was replaceable in presence, if not in funding. The documents told a different story. They told a story of centrality, of legal responsibility, of infrastructure. The contrast was striking. Sometime near dawn, I called someone I trusted. Not a lawyer. Not yet. Someone who had known me long enough to recognize my tone without me having to explain it. He listened. He didn't interrupt. When I finished outlining the situation, he didn't offer sympathy. He offered a question. He asked me what outcome I wanted. That question landed harder than anything Lily had said. I realized I hadn't been asked that in a long time. Not directly. Not honestly. I told him I didn't want revenge. I didn't want confrontation. I didn't want leverage. I wanted alignment. I wanted my external role to reflect the internal one they had already assigned me. He paused, then said something that stayed with me. He said that withdrawal can be a form of truth-telling when words are no longer effective. By the time the sun came up, I had made a decision that felt less like an action and more like a correction. I wasn't going to argue for inclusion. I wasn't going to demand acknowledgement. I was going to remove the contradiction. Over the next few days, I moved quietly. I contacted a realtor I had worked with before. I told her I wanted the Ridgewood house listed discreetly. Price to move. No open houses. No announcements. Just execution. She asked if everything was all right. I told her I was simplifying. The wedding vendors received cancellation notices framed in neutral language. Personal changes. Shifts in circumstance. The contracts allowed for it. Deposits were reclaimed where possible. Timelines were respected. No bridges were burned. Ellen noticed the for sale sign on the lawn before she noticed that my clothes were no longer in the closet. That detail still strikes me. She asked me what I was doing. I told her I was removing myself, the way her daughter had asked. There was a pause. A long one. For the first time since the tasting, she looked uncertain. Not angry. Not defensive. Just momentarily unprepared. She asked if we could talk. I told her we already had. Lily called later that afternoon. Her tone had changed. The certainty was gone. In its place was flexibility, openness, a sudden willingness to compromise. She said maybe there had been a misunderstanding, that perhaps there was room to revisit things, that she hadn't meant for me to feel excluded. She said the invitation could be restored. I declined it. Not dramatically, not with bitterness. I told her that invitations offered under pressure don't feel like invitations. There was silence on the line, then confusion, then something that sounded like disbelief. I ended the call calmly. That evening, alone in the house that was no longer mine in spirit, I walked through the rooms slowly, not reminiscing, counting. In the kitchen, I placed a single envelope on the counter. Inside wasn't a demand, or a note asking for understanding. It was a ledger, every expense, every transfer, every emergency covered, every time I had shown up without being asked over 13 years. Not annotated, not emotional, just documented. At the end, a short note, not asking for repayment, not asking for gratitude, just documenting what absence had looked like before I chose it. The calls began the next morning. I didn't answer, because by then the first crack in the narrative had already formed. They were beginning to realize that removing someone doesn't only take words. It takes infrastructure. And once that infrastructure is gone, what's left is the story you told yourself, and whether it still holds without support. The reaction didn't come all at once. It never does. It arrived in fragments, staggered across days, as the implications of my absence began to register. First confusion, then urgency, then the quiet recalculation that happens when people realize a structure they relied on has been removed without ceremony. Ellen tried again to talk to me the following evening. Not confrontationally, carefully. She asked where I was staying now that the house was listed and my things were gone. I told her I had taken a short-term rental nearby. I didn't give her the address. Not out of secrecy, but because I no longer felt obligated to make my movements legible. She asked if this was temporary. I asked her what she meant by temporary. She said until things settled down. That phrasing stayed with me. Things settling down implied that something had been disturbed, not revealed. That the issue was turbulence rather than truth. I told her I wasn't trying to make a point. I was aligning my actions with the role that had been defined for me. I said that if I was not family in moments that mattered symbolically, then it didn't make sense for me to continue acting as infrastructure. She didn't argue with that. She couldn't. Instead, she asked if Lily knew how serious this was. I told her Lily had been very clear about what she wanted. That night, Ellen didn't sleep either. I could hear it in the messages she sent later, longer than usual, circling the same questions from different angles, as if repetition might soften the conclusion. She asked whether canceling the wedding was necessary, whether there was room for compromise now that Lily was open to discussion again. I didn't respond, because compromise implies a shared misunderstanding. There wasn't one. The truth was simply becoming visible. Over the next few days, more details surfaced, not because I went looking for them, but because removal has a way of pulling hidden assumptions into the open. The vendors began calling Ellen directly. They wanted clarification, confirmation, revised billing contacts. She hadn't realized how many of the arrangements had gone through me exclusively. She hadn't noticed because she hadn't needed to. Things had always worked. Now they didn't. The venue requested a new guarantor. The caterer asked about payment restructuring. The band wanted assurance they would still be compensated for holding the date. None of it was dramatic, just procedural. Lily called again. This time her voice carried strain, not apology, stress. She said she hadn't realized how much depended on me. She said she thought Ellen was co-signing things. She said she assumed the financial side was more flexible. Assumed. I listened without interrupting. She said they were scrambling now. That downsizing the wedding would mean disappointing people. That it would look bad. That there were expectations. Expectations. I told her that expectations are easier to manage when they're built on consent rather than assumption. She asked what I wanted. I told her the same thing I had told my friend days earlier. Alignment. Not gratitude. Not acknowledgement. Just consistency between how I was treated and how I was positioned. There was a long silence. Then she said she didn't understand why I was doing this now, so close to the wedding. I told her I hadn't chosen the timing. The timing had chosen me. Because the truth is, exclusion is cumulative. It builds quietly until a single moment makes the structure impossible to ignore. For me, that moment had been the tasting. The public nature of it stripped away the last illusion that this was about sensitivity or grief. It revealed it as categorization. Once you see that, continuing as before becomes a form of self-erasure. Ellen moved out before the divorce papers were filed. There was no confrontation, no shouting. She packed carefully, methodically, as if leaving a place she had already emotionally vacated. She said she needed space to think. I told her I understood. I meant it. The house sold quickly. The market was favorable, and the pricing had been intentional. When the sale closed, I didn't feel relief. I felt completion. A loop closed cleanly. I left the city not long after. I relocated to a small coastal town in Oregon. Nothing grand. A modest place near the water. I wanted something that required maintenance but not explanation. I volunteered a few mornings a week. Took up woodworking in earnest. There's something grounding about building objects that serve a purpose and don't ask for interpretation. People there didn't know my history. They didn't know what I had funded or facilitated or absorbed. They knew me only as I was in front of them. That felt honest. Occasionally, someone would ask if I had children. I would pause, then say no. Not bitterly. Not defensively. Just accurately. Lily reached out once more months later. A message carefully worded. She said she hoped I was well. That she had been thinking about things. That maybe time had given her perspective. I didn't respond. Not because I was punishing anyone. But because roles, once assigned and accepted, don't require continued negotiation. I had respected the one they gave me. I had left. And in leaving, I had finally stopped trying to prove I belonged somewhere that had already decided otherwise. The last confrontation didn't look the way people imagine confrontations are supposed to look. There was no dramatic meeting, no raised voices, no final speech delivered across a table. By the time the truth reached them fully, I was already gone in every way that mattered. Still, there was a moment when everything inverted. It happened the night before the house officially closed. I went back alone. The Ridgewood house was empty by then. No furniture. No photos on the walls. The echoes were sharper without fabric to soften them. Every footstep reminded me how sound behaves differently when there's nothing left to absorb it. I didn't go there out of nostalgia. I had already grieved the idea of that home long before the paperwork began. I went because there was one final thing to leave behind. Something that couldn't be argued with, reframed, or dismissed as emotion. I walked through the room slowly. Not reminiscing. Verifying. The kitchen light flickered the same way it always had. The hallway still carried the faint scent of old paint and dust. The master bedroom felt smaller without the bed, like a space that had never really belonged to either of us. In the kitchen, I placed a single envelope on the counter. Inside wasn't a letter in the way people expect letters to be. There was no accusation, no explanation, no attempt to persuade. It was a ledger, page after page. Dates, amounts, transfers, emergency expenses, tuition gaps, medical bills, repairs, insurance deductibles, last-minute rescues that were never framed as rescues because framing them that way would have implied dependence. 13 years reduced to columns and totals. At the end, there was one page that wasn't financial. It listed time, school pickups, college visits, long drives after midnight, weekends rearranged, vacations postponed, phone calls answered without hesitation. Rooms sat in quietly when someone didn't know how to say what they needed. No commentary, no justification, just record. The final page held a short note, handwritten. It said I wasn't asking for repayment. I wasn't asking for recognition. I wasn't asking to be included. It said this was simply documentation so that absence, when it was finally chosen, wouldn't be mistaken for abandonment. I sealed the envelope and left it where it would be impossible to ignore. The calls began the next morning. Ellen called first, then Lily, then Ellen again. Then numbers I didn't recognize, vendors, relatives, people trying to understand why the infrastructure beneath the wedding had disappeared overnight. I didn't answer, because by then, something irreversible had happened. They had reached the point where explanations would no longer help them reframe the story. They weren't calling to understand me. They were calling to understand how to stabilize what had collapsed. The wedding did happen, just not the one they planned. It was smaller, quieter, held months later in a different location. People whispered about the changes. Assumptions were made. Stories filled the gaps where facts were missing. I wasn't part of any of them. Ellen moved out before the divorce papers were even filed. She didn't contest anything. Neither did I. There was no appetite left on either side for negotiation. We had both finally stopped pretending there was something left to preserve. The divorce was procedural, clean, respectful in the way two people are respectful when they've already emotionally separated and no longer feel the need to win. There was no final conversation. We had already had it, just not out loud. I left the state not long after. Oregon had always appealed to me for reasons I couldn't quite articulate. Maybe it was the way the coastline doesn't perform for anyone. It's there, solid and indifferent, whether you notice it or not. I bought a modest place near the water. Nothing impressive. Nothing that required explanation. I built shelves, fixed things myself, learned the grain of different woods. Let my hands do work that didn't involve interpretation or emotional accounting. I volunteered, quietly, no backstory offered, no role assumed. People there knew me only as I presented myself. That felt like relief. Every so often, someone would ask if I had children. I would pause, not out of pain but out of precision. Then I would say no. That answer surprised some people. It didn't surprise me, because fatherhood, I had learned, isn't just about presence or contribution. It's about being acknowledged as essential rather than optional. And once you are defined as optional long enough, the most honest thing you can do is stop occupying the space. Lily reached out once more months later. A message that suggested reflection. Regret, perhaps, or simply the discomfort of sitting with consequences that couldn't be undone. I didn't respond, not because I was punishing her, but because responses imply an open negotiation. And the negotiation had ended the moment my role was clarified without my consent. They wanted me gone, so I left completely, not in anger, not in bitterness, but with the calm certainty that comes when you finally stop trying to earn a place you were never meant to keep. Life didn't announce itself as better after I left. It didn't reward me with sudden peace or poetic symmetry. What it offered instead was quiet, real quiet, the kind that isn't absence but space. In the beginning, that space felt unfamiliar. Not empty, just unclaimed. Mornings without obligation. Evenings without anticipation or dread. I woke up to the sound of water instead of conversation I had to interpret. I went to sleep without replaying interactions to see where I might have misstepped. The coastal town moved at a pace that didn't require explanation. People nodded when they passed you. They didn't ask who you were connected to or what you'd done before arriving. They cared whether you returned your cart, whether you showed up when you said you would, whether you left things better than you found them. That suited me. I volunteered at a community workshop that repaired furniture for families who couldn't afford replacements. Old tables, broken chairs, cabinets that had outlived their owners. I learned quickly that wood remembers pressure. You can see where it's been stressed, where it's been forced to carry weight it wasn't designed for. You don't punish it for that. You reinforce it. You let it settle into something sturdier. The metaphor wasn't lost on me. Some evenings, I sat on the porch and watched the horizon disappear into fog. There was comfort in the predictability of it. The ocean didn't need me to be anything other than present. It didn't care what I'd funded or facilitated or endured. Occasionally, memories surfaced, not sharply but gently. Lily as a teenager, asking for help with something she didn't want to ask her mother about. Ellen laughing in the kitchen before things became careful and quiet. Moments that had been real even if their meaning had changed. I didn't rewrite them. I let them exist without demanding they justify what came later. The wedding photos eventually appeared online. I didn't seek them out, but they found their way to me through acquaintances who didn't know the history. It was a smaller event like I'd been told. Different venue. Fewer people. Everyone smiling in a way that suggested effort rather than ease. I felt nothing when I saw them. No anger. No sadness. Just distance. Ellen finalized the divorce without contest. The paperwork arrived one afternoon, neat and unadorned. I signed it and mailed it back the same day. There was nothing left to negotiate. We had both already stepped into lives that didn't overlap. She never asked for reconciliation. I never offered it. Months passed. Seasons changed. I built a dining table from reclaimed oak. It wasn't perfect. One leg bore the mark of an old crack that had been stabilized but not erased. I liked that about it. It didn't pretend to be untouched. One afternoon, I received another message from Lily. It was longer this time. Thoughtful. She said she'd been in therapy. That she was beginning to understand how much she'd taken for granted. She said she hadn't realized what consistency actually cost. That she was sorry for how things had unfolded. I read it once. Then I put the phone down. Not because I doubted her sincerity. Not because I wanted her to suffer. But because apologies don't always require response to be valid. Sometimes they're meant to change the person who offers them, not the one who receives them. Responding would have reopened something I had already closed carefully. It would have invited reinterpretation, revision, the suggestion that the role I had been assigned was now negotiable. It wasn't. I had finally accepted it. People here sometimes ask why I never married again, why I live alone, why my life seems so deliberate. I tell them I value alignment. They usually nod, not fully understanding, but respecting the answer. Every so often, someone asks if I have children. I say no. And for the first time, that answer doesn't feel like loss. It feels accurate. Because what I learned slowly, and without drama, is that belonging isn't something you earn through endurance. It's something that's either offered freely or withheld quietly. And when it's withheld long enough, the most dignified thing you can do is stop reaching for it. They wanted me gone. So I left. Completely. And in doing so, I didn't lose a family. I reclaimed myself.